I think we're really grateful and really privileged to have you come to our AGM and talk to us with up-to-date and constantly moving knowledge as the situation changes. So I'll just give you a really brief intro and then I'll pass it over to you. So Melanie is a consultant, coach, educator, translator and writer on cross-cultural issues and is a licensed Māori language translator and interpreter. And she specialises in advising on the application of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the treaty principles to conservation and environmental issues. So yes, we're very, very lucky to have you here tonight and we're really excited to hear what you have to say with regards to the recent situation and how it's unfolding from your perspective and how we might be able to glean some new information from that. So I'll pass over to you and I think you should be able to share your screen, but let us know.
Kia ora, Summer. Thanks so much. And yeah, thank you all for having me along. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, cool. I'll just share my screen. All right, is that showing up okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Cool. So I'm here to talk to you about the Treaty Principles Bill, but as Summer says, it's constantly evolving. And so it turns out I'm also going to talk to you about its dangerous cousin, which is slipping under the radar. It's dull but dangerous cousin. And this is an analysis I've been working on just in the last week or two, and it's not yet published, but it hopefully will be very soon. So yeah, Summer's introduced me already. I do a mixture of things and research and analysis, cross-cultural coaching and supervision and workshops on Te Tiriti and the treaty principles. I've also got a podcast, Weaving Our Worlds, if you're interested. And I write on Substack now too. So the Treaty Principles Bill and the Regulatory Standards Bill is its boring sounding cousin. I haven't published this analysis yet, but I decided to share it with you tonight because we have the opportunity and word needs to get around about another avenue that a similar sort of thing is happening. So if you do want to know when it's published, you can follow me on Substack because I'll notify there when it's published, wherever it's published. So I'll just do a brief summary of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi in case anyone's not familiar with them. So the treaty principles originated in 1975 when the government included it in the Treaty of Waitangi Act, establishing the Waitangi Tribunal. And the intention of the principles was to bring out the essence of the Māori text of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and what at the time was called the English text of the treaty, but is now more known as the English draft because it was the Māori text that was signed and discussed generally. So they've evolved as common law treaty principles over 40 years now. And so the common law treaty principles are partnership, which includes good faith, active protection of Māori interests and redress. And there's also a broader set of principles which the Waitangi Tribunal have developed, but they're not common law principles yet. So the phrase the treaty principles or principles of the treaty appears in over 40 laws. It's used to interpret not just those laws, but actually any laws that don't explicitly rule it out. And it's also used through the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee Manual to develop all legislation. And the treaty principles also define the jurisdiction of the Waitangi Tribunal, which is to inquire into breaches of those principles by the Crown. So the current government bill, it was initiated by the ACT Party, but it's a government bill, not a private member's bill. It's currently at Select Committee. And the ACT Party claims that those proposed principles are what the Māori text of Te Tiriti says. So side passing the debate about the two texts, they're going straight to what the legitimate one is, the Te Reo Māori one. And they rely on what's known as the Kāwharu translation. However, the issue with what they're doing is that their proposed principles are not actually derived from Te Tiriti. They look a little bit like it. There's some similar words and concepts, but you could say it's a deep fake rather than actually anything to do with Te Tiriti itself. So they've cherry-picked partial phrases and then decontextualized them linguistically, historically, and culturally. And at the moment, the perceived impact, I guess, around the country is that the only impact, not diminishing, but the sole impact, is to displace Te Tiriti and its principles in our laws. And what I've been focusing on is that actually it's not just an erasure of Te Tiriti and its principles, but they're actually being replaced. And replaced with what is the big question we'll get to soon. So in terms of the impacts and the erasure of the legal impact of Te Tiriti, there's a lot of different impacts here. You will have no doubt heard of some of them. It strengthens the role of the Crown and removes the role of tino rangatiratanga for iwi and hapu that was guaranteed under Te Tiriti. It conflates tino rangatiratanga, which is primarily a collective right and unique to Māori, and it conflates that with individual sovereignty or self-determination and private property rights. It also makes tino rangatiratanga meaningless by redefining and giving it to everybody, but is something that it's not. It delegitimizes affirmative action based on ethnicity and other factors, or other factors. It delegitimizes consultation with iwi and hapu, treaty partnership, and co-governance. So those things would all become illegal if the Treaty Principles Bill was passed, at least with the Crown. It removes Indigenous rights unless prescribed by historical treaty settlement. And the historical is quite important there, because not all treaty settlements are historical, and treaty settlements certainly aren't the treaty. They're 1 or 2% compensation for what was lost historically, but the treaty is an ongoing living document. It also reverses the common law assumption that customary title is retained unless it's explicitly removed by legislation. And it also removes the possibility of contemporary treaty claims to the Waitangi Tribunal of breaches by the current, any government now or into the future. So those are the key impacts on Te Tiriti. There's probably more, but that's a bit of an overview. So my analysis of the Treaty Principles Bill is that it would provide a libertarian overlay to the treaty, and actually to all of our legislation, because legislation is interpreted with the treaty principles if it's included. So over 40 pieces of legislation would have this ideology parachuted into them. Further, the courts also refer to the treaty principles unless it's explicitly denied in legislation. So it's, as I said before, it's not just erasure, that they're being replaced. And the current commentary is that they're being replaced with a set of broad liberal values that are very widely accepted. And I've dived into that quite a lot. Some of you may have read my earlier work on this, which did spread around but didn't pick up mainstream traction. So the meaning of the proposed principles really depends on the ideology of the person that's expressing them or talking about them. And the common usage aligns with progressive interpretations. So what we understand them to mean in common usage is more what progressive politicians would mean by them. However, the libertarian definitions of the key terms contained in the Act all but invert the common usage meanings. And they're very, very specific. And so it seems that this may be a strategic move to enshrine libertarian values in constitutional law. The treaty being a part of our patchwork constitution. So the King's Council recently confirmed that it wouldn't just redefine the treaty principles, but it would actually redefine the treaty articles themselves in law. Well, of course, not actually touching the original treaty document. So it's claimed that they're not actually changing the treaty itself. So if we look at some of the key terms, equality before the law, the libertarian interpretation of this is to oppose affirmative action and group-based approaches, for example, ethnicity or gender, and to focus on equality of opportunity, not outcomes, so not looking at equity. They also claim that equality before the law means they oppose redistribution via taxation, which is viewed as discriminating based on income. If we look at without discrimination, which is also part of the principles, libertarians interpret this as opposing affirmative action and group-based approaches. Again, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, what have you. And they oppose redistributive measures such as graduated taxation, which is viewed as discriminatory and infringing on property rights. And property rights, in their view, includes income. If we look at fundamental human rights, which is one of the catch cries around this, that we all deserve fundamental human rights, libertarians interpret this as what's framed as negative rights, so freedom from state interference, individual autonomy or self-determination, and property rights. Again, you're probably picking up a bit of a theme. They reject positive rights such as access to education, healthcare, or environmental protection, and see them as an impingement on fundamental human rights rather than being rights themselves. And also the rule of law is important in these proposed principles. And libertarians interpret this as a safeguard against state overreach and a means to protect individual liberty and property rights. Again, and they reject the rule of law and that ideology as a tool to address collective societal goals or inequalities and to ensure public welfare. So these are the key concepts that are contained in the proposed treaty principles. And so they mean vastly different things to different people. And my alarm bells went off because the ACT Party has libertarian foundations, and so it seemed likely that they would be wanting to progress and advance those definitions rather than the broad liberal generally accepted definitions. But the Treaty Principles Bill, when it came out, I was surprised to see that it didn't contain definitions of any of these terms. But these libertarian definitions do align with Seymour's rhetoric. You may have heard him midway through a debate start talking about the need to address education and health and housing and development in these issues. And it seems like he's distracting from the actual conversation and changing the topic away from the treaty principles. But it seems to me that he's actually talking about what the treaty principles would do and that they would advance a libertarian approach to all of those issues, to everything that we're dealing with. So, and Seymour has also said, and he said this in the debate with Helmut Modlik, that the Treaty Principles Bill will change the whole environment that land use laws and every other kind of law is made in. So one wonders, would it be left to the courts and extensive litigation to decide the meanings? And I suspect not, given that Seymour's very criticism of the current treaty principles are that the courts have developed the meanings over time. So it turns out that the answer lies elsewhere, and that the Treaty Principles Bill would in fact be a lens to interpret all legislation. So came to my attention that ACT is also progressing a regulatory standards bill, which you may or may not have heard of. If you have, I imagine, like most people, you've gone, oh my God, that sounds boring, which I did too, but I thought I should take a look at it. So it turns out it's the Treaty Principles Bill's dull and very dangerous cousin, and is essentially progressing a very similar set of impacts and values as the Treaty Principles Bill. So the ACT National Coalition Agreement is to actually pass this bill, the regulatory one, and consultation quietly opened last week and closes on the 13th of January, a week after the Treaty Principles Bill submission closes. So the only person I've seen who's written about this much is Emeritus Professor Jane Kelsey, and she described it in a book where she's detailed this bill as meta-regulation to regulate the regulators. And she described it as being a straitjacket to constrain future governments. So under the Regulatory Standards Bill, I'll call it the RSB, all future legislation should align with a certain set of principles. I'll get to what the principles are soon. And after 10 years, all existing legislation, pre-existing legislation will be reviewed and adjusted to align with this set of principles in the RSB. I hope you're feeling anxious, because at this point I certainly was, as I delved into these impacts and the interrelationship with the Treaty Principles Bill. So the Regulatory Standards Bill would, if the Treaty Principles Bill would be a libertarian overlay, the Regulatory Bill would be a libertarian foundation to our nation's future. So it contains a set of libertarian principles which emphasise individual liberties, private property rights, minimal government intervention, and restrictions on taxes and charges. And it also contains a selective aspects of the rule of law. Remember, the rule of law is explicit in the Treaty Principles Bill. This RSB introduces a right of appeal to an independent body of administrative decisions, so that's by the executive branch of government, and it creates a new judicial role of reviewing and declaring legislation inconsistent with these principles, the set of primarily libertarian principles and individualistic, property rights centred. Courts can't strike down legislation, and governments can choose to legislate in a way that's not consistent with these principles, with the proviso that it would be appropriate in a free and democratic society, which probably also has a narrow meaning. However, the political and procedural costs of paying the costs of appeals and the political embarrassment of constantly being in contradiction with legislation to what would be a part of our constitution, because this is also a constitutional bill, are likely to really deter governments overriding it very often. So the relationship between the Treaty Principles Bill and the Regulatory Standards Bill is interesting. The RSB was conceived by the Business Roundtable, which is now called the New Zealand Initiative. And it was around the idea of having an economic constitution. So principles which underlie the economic decisions and consequently, most decisions that governments make. And the first incarnation of both of these bills was introduced by ACT in 2006. And they've both been opposed in previous parliamentary processes and haven't gotten any further. And they have also both been criticised as dangerous constitutional shifts. And they both contain really complementary and quite similar sets of libertarian principles as the guiding core part of both bills. So here's the critical touch point with the Treaty Principles Bill. Section 10.1 of the 2021 RSB, sorry, mandates that laws be interpreted in line with its principles wherever possible. And so the RSB has been largely unchanged since 2006, and even since before then, the Business Roundtable drafted the bill. It actually came directly from them as a draft, and it hasn't changed a lot since then. So it's likely that this section would still be in the 2025 version. So that would require the interpretation of the Treaty Principles Bill's ambiguous concepts to align with the Regulatory Standard Bill's libertarian principles. So where there's a choice between how something is interpreted, as we saw before, in future, once the RSB passes and the government has agreed to pass it, then all laws should be interpreted with its principles wherever possible. So interpreted through a libertarian lens when that is an allowable and possible meaning for a term. So that means that Act's interpretations of the proposed treaty principles would apply, giving supremacy to individual and property rights at the expense of broader liberal values and at the expense of collective, environmental and equitable rights or interests. And this is not yet known because these definitions aren't included in the Treaty Principles Bill. And so if anyone does, the people that do realise they're ambiguous may not be able to figure out how Act would get their way with the rhetoric and narrative they're expressing about what the treaty principles would do. Because I do think they're not really hiding this as such. Like when I listen to their narrative about what the Treaty Principles Bill would do, they're kind of putting it out there. It's just we don't know what their terms mean because they're the inversion of the common usage. And so without speaking libertarianish, it's really hard to see that, and from their perspective, they're actually talking sense, not nonsense about their proposed principles. So these two bills are really distinct from each other, but very complementary. Both are anti-equity, anti-environment, and anti-treaty. Both could block consideration of Te Tiriti and its actual principles in future lawmaking and judicial interpretation. The RSB focuses primarily on the creation of laws, but as we saw, Section 10 is also gives it the role of guiding the interpretation of all laws. The Treaty Principles Bill is primarily about interpreting laws, but the Treaty Principles, at least currently under the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee manual, are also about creating laws, but presumably that manual would get dumped or adjusted once the RSB has passed. And so the RSB's really individualistic, property-focused principles clash totally with the collective rights and interests of iwi and hapu recognised by Te Tiriti and upheld through its common law principles. So if the common law treaty principles do continue alongside the RSB principles, then it may create conflicting constitutional interests. And so this may be one of the drivers for the Treaty Principles Bill, because actually I think the Regulatory Standards Bill is the main course, and the Treaty Principles Bill may be a bit of a red herring that is distracting perhaps from the most significant change that would also achieve the change which the Treaty Principles Bill is trying to do. So it's kind of two approaches to do the same thing. And in my view, both need opposing and exposing. But it may be that even if the Treaty Principles Bill doesn't pass, the RSB would achieve very similar outcomes. So kia tūpato. Be careful, take care. The symbiotic effects of these two interrelated bills are absolutely profound, and I've obviously given a very summarised version today. And these impacts are also flying under the radar because we're very focused on, and rightly so, focused on the impacts on the treaty. But that is distracting from this dull sounding cousin of the Treaty Principles Bill that hasn't yet attracted the public's attention but is moving now. So discussing, we as a nation really are discussing and submitting, and I hope some of you are submitting on the Treaty Principles Bill, on really sweeping constitutional change through either or both of these bills. And we're doing that without understanding what these extensive proposals would mean to our country and our lives as New Zealanders, and for OraTaiao, equity and environmental outcomes are two of the absolutely core values that would be annihilated by these two bills. So have your say. Our written submissions on the Treaty Principles Bill close on 7th of January, and consultation on the Regulatory Standards Bill closes on the 13th of January. I think there probably will be a select committee process on the Regulatory Standards Bill next year, but it's also conceivable there wouldn't be a very long one, as it has been through select committee before. So yeah, that was the update, what I've been thinking about this week.
Kia ora, Melanie. Thank you so much. I'm indeed anxious now, so I think your talk was really successful and also really insightful. I think equipping us at OraTaiao with this level of insight is really critical for helping us to understand these kind of nebulous and complicated processes. So thank you very much. I guess I'll start with just a really broad and maybe difficult question is, what do you think us at OraTaiao and our members can do in opposition to this, on top of a submission? Is there anything else that you've been thinking about lately?
I think, one really important thing is letting people know. So I'll be publishing my analysis next week, one way or another. Earlier in the year, I didn't have any luck getting my analysis of the Treaty Principles Bill as a libertarian constitutional takeover published. But I feel like the time's kind of ripe now. I suspect it will get published, but if not, I'll self-publish and then would need lots of help spreading it around. I think letting people know what's flying under the radar, and also this whole set of meanings. So we're really focused on this is what it will do to the treaty, but we're focusing on it'll erase the treaty rather than it's being actually replaced, and with what. And so that's the huge question that it strikes me as very strange that we haven't asked. I think the more that particularly non-Māori voices can get heard championing te tiriti and these effects, the better, because it's easier for it to be framed as a Māori issue. And Māori predominantly obviously will be quite focused on the treaty and probably won't have a lot of headspace, those who are really active on that space, to submit and talk about the impacts of these libertarian aspects on us all. That's the thing, it's been really, really cleverly framed as a Māori issue and a treaty issue, which means most people's eyes glaze over or they jump up to fight for te tiriti. So bringing awareness to that's really important. If you do writing and things like that, write about the impacts for health and for all New Zealanders that could flow from this. Obviously, libertarianism often is, the step that opens up a real neoliberal environment for privatisation and inequity. So I think that's important. And Luke just said to me, I should say, use the health unions to disseminate information about the Regulatory Standards Bill as well, and about these other impacts of the Treaty Principles Bill. I do think it's really important that everyone's submitting on the Treaty Principles Bill. But I also wonder if it doesn't matter too much to them whether that passes, and they'll just get the Regulatory Standards Bill through while we're all looking at the Treaty Principles Bill. So yeah, whatever we can do to bring attention to this, which I think will be quite hard because it doesn't sound very sexy, and there's probably not going to be a hikoi about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Melanie. We'll be the first to disseminate your work as soon as it's ready.
Cool.
So looking forward to that. I can see Izzy's got her hand up for a question.
Tēnā koe, Melanie. Thanks so much for that presentation. It was fascinating. As a lawyer, I found your legal analysis so interesting. So thanks so much for bringing that to the space. One of the questions that I have is just to clarify around the status of the bill. The RSB. And am I right in saying that it's, and sorry, my internet is quite poor, so I cut in and out a little bit, so apologies if you've already covered this, but it's hasn't yet been read for the first time, is that right? So it's like consultation on the kind of general approach of the bill. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
right.
cool.
So it hasn't had its first reading. There's some consultation documents out. If you Google consultation regulatory standards bill, you'll find them.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and for anyone really wanting to deep dive, there's a report, which was the report in which the Business Roundtable drafted the bill the first time by Bryce Wilkinson, called Constraining Government Regulation, I think. And that's actually acknowledged on the consultation page for this bill, and that's a 200 or 300 page report, but it goes into a lot of detail about, especially the second half of the report goes into a lot of detail about, I guess, their whole values and the way they think things should work. And so it was a really useful background for actually, if you want to get into some deeper understanding about it and the thinking. Help me sort of get into their heads a bit, which was helpful.
Yeah, nice. And just like a follow-on question, which I guess is in two parts, is and no worries if maybe this hasn't been clear and like the government's intention, but there's not like a contingent relationship between TSB and RSB, right? In the sense that the regulatory standards bill is not contingent on the treaty settlement bill passing. And the kind of part B of that question, in your research of the regulatory standards bill, do you think that there are any other elements, like, because obviously it's not just concerning, in my like quick Googling, regulation regarding te tiriti or the te tiriti principles, like it's broader regulation. And so is there anything that you think that would be good to, like, beyond this fantastic analysis that you've provided, good as an organization like ourselves concerned with climate change and health, that you may think that we could provide a distinct voice on, that perhaps is going to be missing from some of the other organizations that may have opposition to the bill?
Yeah, really good questions. So they're not contingent on each other at all. Like, they haven't been linked publicly at all by ACT or anyone, as far as I can see. And yeah, I think in terms of whether they would both need to pass to have the full effect, I've been really contemplating that, and I suspect that probably just the regulatory standards bill could achieve most, if not all, of what it wants to achieve. And you're right, it's the regulatory standards bill is not about the treaty stuff at all. Like, it excludes the treaty from its principles, but it's about all regulation apart from local government regulation, and it's about all legislation, which is, huge. It's everything. And like I said, within 10 years there'll be a retrospective review of all existing legislation to bring it into alignment with the principles in the regulatory standards bill. So I think, like, where I've sort of come to with my thinking around if the treaty principles bill also needs to pass, there's that question that if you only had the RSB pass, you'd have these highly individualistic property, limited government, anti-environment, anti-equity, anti-collective principles at the constitutional level used to interpret legislation as well as create it. And you'd still have the common law treaty principles, which are very collective, quite prioritise the environment and equity and things. And so they'd be there too, and they'd be really potentially conflicting and competing, and who knows what would happen. But it sort of has occurred to me that even in that situation, it's possible they don't actually need the Treaty Principles Bill to pass, because the way the Regulatory Standards Bill is written in the 2021, and it will probably be similar-ish, though I think they're tweaking the words a bit. There's that Section 10 requirement that where there's a way to interpret legislation consistently with those principles, that route is to be taken. And so at first I thought that wouldn't apply to the current treaty principles because they're common law treaty principles. And I was thinking, oh, they would have to pass the Treaty Principles Bill to not have that conflict. But then, you know, I realised that the treaty principle clauses are throughout legislation, although New Zealand First is try and take them out or reduce them. But potentially, you know, potentially one of the goals, or perhaps the primary goal, I don't know what their intent is, of the current treaty principles debate is to introduce an alternative set of principles that are libertarian rather than treaty-based, and to legitimise those in the public eye. And so then when you had to interpret the treaty principles clauses in legislation via the lens of the Regulatory Standards Bill, instead of just having, well, these are the treaty principles, they're partnership, they're, you know, collective tino rangatiratanga, etc. If the false definitions that we're seeing advanced now were normalised and legitimised, and they've been in a bill that's gone to Parliament and Select Committee, potentially there'd be some force there to convince the courts or push the courts to have to prioritise those libertarian interpretations, even though they're not common law. So you probably are in a better position to figure that one out than me, being a lawyer. But yeah, that's sort of my current thoughts around how contingent they each are on the other. Yeah, does that answer your questions?
Yes, so helpful. Thank you so much.
And I think in terms of what you guys do, like, I think anything's great because no one is addressing this stuff at the moment. So yeah, everything that gets it out there, and you know, I think probably a lot of it might not get a lot of media attention, so potentially it's that background networking to your friends and colleagues in your sector and in different sectors to go, hey, you need to actually submit some consultation on this too and keep an eye on this one. And yeah, I also do think, like a lot of those I've seen speaking out against the Treaty Principles Bill, it's been largely the Māori health experts or the Māori lawyers, and it's expanding now. We've had the KC speak out, but it has been primarily Māori voices that have been picked up. Now Forest and Bird has a campaign, and I think the need to mainstream that is really important. So I would bear that in mind, because otherwise it will probably, you know, it'll probably get ignored if it just seems to be about the treaty. And I guess I'm thinking ahead to potential referendum is more the time frame I'm thinking in. So not wanting everyone to misperceive and make up their mind that it's just about the treaty. That's the biggest danger, I think, is that that's making a lot of people not care and not be interested, but actually people need to know it affects them and how they go to the doctor and whether they have a clean river to swim in and those kinds of things. So it's really that shifting of the framing.
Thank you, Melanie. There's a quick question in the chat. It's a political question. Where would New Zealand First stand regarding the ORSB, or is there any, do we know?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know, but presumably they've signed up to pass it with the government because it's part of the coalition agreement with ACT and National. So in the same way that New Zealand First doesn't support the treaty principles bill. They voted for it at the first reading. So yeah, I think I don't actually know what their stance would be. They're not really a libertarian party, but they do have some libertarian tendencies, and Winston can be pretty random, but is probably more populist than libertarian. So yeah, I don't know is the short answer, but yeah, the agreement is for it to be passed. So that's a coalition-wide thing. But definitely potentially somewhere the political pressure could get put on to slow it down, or whether they even realise what what it has in it. I don't know if New Zealand First was in Parliament the other times it's been through the House, the RSB. There's some two good Hansard records from 2006 and 2021 with various MPs speaking strongly against it, but I don't recall whether New Zealand First was specifically there. But they spoke very strongly against the Treaty Principles Bill in 2006 and said it looks like X shaped its ideology to look like the treaty and put it into this bill. So that's interesting. Yeah.
They would have been, I think, in government in 2006.
Yeah.
Not in 2021, I'd expect.
Yeah, okay. I have to look back at Hansard and see about that, what they said about it. But that may not be consistent with what they would say now.
And I've one question for myself as well. Is there any similar overseas legislation that has led to terrible outcomes that we can point to in terms of advocacy?
Yeah, good call. I don't know specifically in terms of legislation, but I do know that around the world it is the approach of libertarianism to try and constitutionalize its values, because they're not very popular. And so when they can convince people enough to actually get something passed, since the time of Friedman and Hayek, it's been an approach to constitutionalize. And so this does align with that. And there are countries around the world where that has happened in different ways. One of the obvious examples is Chile's constitution, which has very similar concepts in it, actually. And, that's from the time of Pinochet, and it's still not really been able to be changed much because it was entrenched and they haven't had the numbers to change it. So that still binds current governments, obviously probably a bit more extreme over there in terms of authoritarianism and stuff than we perhaps imagine things getting here. And yeah, there's a really good book called Democracy in Chains by Nancy somebody. And she's written about the rollout. I don't remember if she wrote about the legislation directly, but she wrote about how this stuff's played out in some states in America, and it was just terrifying, like voucher systems for school and health, which means that the centres then get to choose who they accept and who they don't. So although everyone has the same opportunity, they're disallowed entry into certain schools. Nancy McLean. So that's worth a read if you're wanting to look into it. It's also, I think, was it Indonesia? Naomi Klein's written some good books which outline this kind of stuff rolling out, more of the neoliberal layer, but also that libertarian foundation. So the shock doctrine and doppelganger to some degree have, but yeah, shock doctrine especially looks at quite a few countries around the world that have gone on that path. And it's also really similar sort of foundations to Thatcherism and, to our neoliberal reforms in the 1980s. So this Roger Douglas, wrote a book called Unfinished Business, and that was the last bit of the reforms that he didn't get through, and that was an economic constitution. So this regulating the regulators. And Jane Kelsey's written a book called it's got fire in the name, and that's the one where she's got a chapter on this meta-regulation approach in New Zealand and how it fits in with the other reforms that we had in the 80s. So I think this is sort of like the last piece that they've been wanting to finish off since then, they being those in that kind of ideological circle. The fire economy, that's the one. Yeah. I'd be interested to know about similar legislation in other countries. If you do find stuff. Yeah, it's not something I've had time to get into too much yet, but definitely reading the shock doctrine and some of those books gave me that bigger understanding. Oh, this is actually a global trend and a global effort. It's not unique to New Zealand. So I think that's really helpful to learn from other countries. And I guess we can learn a lot through America being a few years ahead in the misinformation and disinformation approach. So it's very similar tactics playing out here to what played out a few years ago in America, and with Brexit and with the yes vote, and apparently now in Sweden with Norway with an apology to the Sami. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of international examples to explore if someone wants to.
We've got some good suggestions for beach reading over the summer as well, which we just
yeah, very relaxing, and write a little submission while you're at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure this submission times are chosen as well to be the most awkward for people to make submissions to. That's completely unsurprising as well. Any other questions from around the room? No, that is. Thank you, Melanie, for coming along. It was, I won't say an enjoyable talk, but an important one and really, really informative. As you say, and I think we've all probably been guilty of it, that the focus on the Treaty Principles Bill has been there. All the media attention has been there, for better or worse. And I suppose we always have to ask, if our attention is on something big, what's happening in the background. So thank you for drawing these kind of strands together, and there'll be a wee bit of work to be done over the next 6 or 7 weeks, really, because that's all that there is. And I can't remember who in the chat said about drawing in the sort of links we have within the health sector, because health's in a fairly vulnerable position at the moment. Public health is in a fairly vulnerable position. Actually, all of healthcare is actually at the moment, but public health in particular. And there's a very strong sense that it's been softened up for ongoing privatization. And I think highlighting that fact for our professional colleges and unions with these bills going through as sort of facilitating that even further is an important thing for us to do. So we do have a role, and we need to use our voices, really, kind of just make people aware of it. So thank you. Fantastic. Anything else you want to add, or we can move on? Thank you very much, Melanie. Now, you are more than welcome to stay around for the remainder of our fantastic AGM, but you don't have to. I have one question. Those slides, would you be able to send them through, or are they something that you could do, or would you feel it'd be...
Yeah, I can. I'd prefer they don't go too far until I've published my analysis next week. Okay. But yeah, I can send them through, sure.
Maybe let's wait till the analysis is published, I think, and it will remove any temptation then. But